You guys, my wife gave me a wax warmer for Christmas, and she bought me some like Honey Crisp cider scented wax. And so this whole, like, my whole studio area just smells super good right now. By the way, if you want to burn your fingertips off, just touch the metal part to see if it's hot enough to melt wax. Probably is. Anyway, 2019 has been a crazy year for me in relation to my reading habit. I've said it before, but I'll say it again in case you're new here. I spent pretty much my entire adult life not really reading anything, maybe a book a year, if that. I used to love reading, but I had a hard time kindling up that spark of interest that I used to have, and it was just distractions, other priorities. I have lots of other hobbies that I would try to do, and I always wanted to get back to reading, and I never really did. This year, a couple of factors, buying a new Kindle and forcing myself to read, finding the awesome Wayward Pines series by Blake Crouch, and also discovering booktube really just amplified the interest that I had for reading and just kicked it into high gear, and I've been going strong ever since. My Goodreads says that I have read 50 books since July, which isn't completely accurate because it counts short stories as books, but I've read a lot of books this year, and a large portion of that desire came from watching booktube, talking to people on booktube, and making booktube videos. It really encouraged me to keep this hobby and this flame alive. I'm so grateful for the success that my channel has had, for the relationships that I've been forming already on booktube, and just for the awesome books that I've gotten to read in 2019. I made a series of videos where I talked about some of the best 2019 books that I read, and then I reviewed those, but I just kind of wanted to give a general overview for the stuff that I read in 2019 that maybe I haven't talked about as much. First off, another shout out to Wayward Pines. That series is the series that got me back into reading. It was amazing, and I've recommended it a bunch of times. I'm going to recommend it again, especially if you like Blake Crouch, because a lot of people discovered Blake Crouch through his standalone books Dark Matter or 2019's Recursion. I strongly recommend these past books as well. Right after I read those books, I read some books that Amazon Kindle Unlimited likes to recommend, and also my friend read and recommended as well. They were the Extinction Files by A.G. Riddle. These books, Pandemic and Genome, were awesome at keeping my fiction fire going. Pandemic the book has no relation to Pandemic the video game, but my wife and I have played a lot of Pandemic the regular board game, as well as Pandemic Legacy, the kind of like campaign-focused board game version of the Pandemic normal board game, where there's like actually a story. And being familiar with that board game made reading Pandemic the book so awesome, because a lot of things tied in as far as the locale, similar methods of disease control and prevention. Then the Pandemic series also just takes the Pandemic and then completely swerves where the plot is going completely on its head. And that series ended up being awesome and put A.G. Riddle on my map, which, if you haven't seen, A.G. Riddle's Solar War trilogy, which was released entirely in 2019, are probably my favorite 2019 released books. I couldn't put them down, and I loved them. This year I was able to read Alex North's The Whisper Man, which wasn't my favorite book. It was a widely talked about book, and it had a lot of traction behind it, so I read it, and it was enjoyable. And one of the things that I really liked about that book was the audiobook narrator was Christopher Eccleston, the Doctor Who guy and the guy from Thor 2 that you probably didn't know was in Thor 2. He did a great job narrating the audiobook, and I did whip through that story, even if I ended up giving it 3 stars. The Whisper Man was a notable book that was released in 2019 that I also read. Spattered throughout the year, I would read different things from Kindle Unlimited since I still had a subscription to that, including the Jessica Shaw series by Lisa Gray. There was 2 books in there. They're basically detective stories. They weren't my favorite. They were both 3-star books, but thoroughly enjoyable. Speaking of Kindle Unlimited, Blake Crouch compiled a list of 6 short stories, 5 of them by other authors that he respected, and that was released on Kindle Unlimited as some kind of exclusive deal. And I read all those short stories this year, and that was interesting, and it was cool to see something that kind of just dropped out of nowhere, and then everybody read them at the same time, and we're talking about them on Goodreads. They were all focused on different modern sci-fi ponderings, and that was really cool too. This year I discovered NetGalley, and I set up an account with NetGalley, and I was able to get ARCs to read, and I was able to kind of see what some of that process looks like for some of these really small publishers. I read probably 5 or 6 different ARCs this year, and that was a really cool process. I wanted to highlight the book called Marrow Charm, which I think is the very first book review I ever put on YouTube. It's not on this channel. It's not my favorite book review, but it was a good way for me to kind of get used to talking about books in a way that I never had before. Shout out to that book. I think I ended up giving it 4 stars, and the sequel I think is due out next year, and I'll probably be talking about it here on this channel. Since I was already reading again when I hadn't read for so long, I went back to a book that was actually a capstone to a series that I used to love, but I never got around to, and that's Green by Ted Dekker. It's supposed to be the circular piece of what used to be called the Circle Trilogy, which was Black, Red, and White, which eventually included a ton of other Dekker books that were all sharing a universe and sharing a story, and it was a crazy ride that I read all of back in the day, and then never read Green. It came out after basically during my dead period. I was able to read Green, and it was really awesome to be able to go back into that series and see those characters and see the Ted Dekker version of what the last battle from the Chronicles of Narnia looks like. And I have some weird thoughts with that book, but I was glad to be able to finish that off. That was a huge thing. I talked about on one of my other videos how the Inheritance series, finishing that this year, was a capstone. And this was another capstone on something that I had been following or loved for a huge portion of my previous reading life. This year, I was able to discover the Forgotten Realms series. I'd always heard people around the D&D circles, the fantasy circles that I run in, talk about Drizzt, the character from R.A. Salvatore's series, and I started that myself this year. I read the first 3 books. Well, I think it's the prequel trilogy. I think they're actually the second 3 books that were published. I'm not sure. But it's the first 3 chronological books in that series. And those were they weren't the most mind-blowing things that I've ever read in fantasy, but they were the chicken soup for the soul of fantasy for me. And I love them, and I would strongly recommend them to someone looking for fantasy, especially if you love the D&D type magic systems and monsters, etc. Growing up, my dad, who was in the military, is now retired and a military contractor, read a lot of books, and a lot of the books he read were Tom Clancy books, and I've never read a Tom Clancy book, and I think I've only seen 1 Tom Clancy movie, though I have played a lot of Tom Clancy video games, and I like them a lot, though it's usually for the gameplay, which doesn't have to do with the military storylines. So I was curious to give a Tom Clancy book a shot, and I read The Hunt for Red October. It was a completely different experience than what I'm used to reading, and one that I can say wasn't my favorite, but was still thoroughly enjoyable. I think I would give it another shot sometime. I could easily see myself reading another Clancy book or 2 next year as well. I used my new opportunities that I was reading again to read some Christian nonfiction. That is something that I would like to keep incorporating into my stuff going into 2020. I read Defining Deception by Costi Henn, Bruce Shelley's Church History and Plain Language, and the Basic Bible Interpretation book by Roy B. Zuck that I covered in my November wrap-up video. I read a number of classic short stories that were recommended by the guys over at the Codex Cantina. And I did something that old me never would have imagined me doing, which is I chose to step out of my comfort zone and challenge myself, and I chose to read a historical fiction book. I normally do not like those. That was also a romance. I read North and South, and I ended up really liking it and having some strong feelings and opinions about it. It made me actually be willing to try to give another book like that a shot. I was able to talk to my wife about it, who is very much into those sorts of stories, and it just completely surprised me that I enjoyed it as much as I did. I also read a book I've been wanting to read for a very long time, and that is Frank Herbert's Dune. I struggled a lot with that book when I first picked it up because it is very front-loaded with just a heavy amount of completely made-up nouns and verbs in a way that I had a hard time really grasping what was going on, but I pushed through. I ended up buying I was listening to it via audiobook. I picked up a physical copy from a used bookstore here and reread some of the chapters that I was confused about in the beginning as I got further. Ended up absolutely loving that book. I think the ending wasn't my favorite and was extremely rushed, literally the most rushed ending I'd ever seen. but I loved it, and I'm glad to have finally experienced that thanks to being back into reading again. And yeah, I guess I could ramble on forever about this, but the biggest takeaway that I want to have is I am so glad that I am reading again. I'm glad to be here on BookTube. I'm glad that I have bookish friends here that I can talk to, this community to be part of. I'm glad that there are people that are subscribing to my channel because they're enjoying hearing me talk about books. I love watching your guys' videos where you talk about books. I love to be reading, and I want to continue doing so in 2020. This is going to be the last video that I put up for 2020. I want you guys to have a happy new year. I hope you have a good New Year's celebration. And I hope that going into 2020, we can all continue this awesome bookish journey together. Thank you guys for watching. Have a great new year. Should odd acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind? Should odd acquaintance be forgot and days of odd lang syne?